Good evening. My name is Layla Ilaraza, and I'm a student project manager and supervisor at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues here at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clarke Forum and Dickinson College, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Real-World Effects of AI. This program is part of the Clarke Forum's Leadership in an Age of Uncertainty series. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the event of an emergency, accessible exits are located through the door behind me. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. During the question and answer session, we ask that you keep questions succinct so that anybody who would like to has time to ask their question. As a show of respect for our panelists and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879, as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. As an English and political science major, writing is central to my academic studies. For the most part, my classes forbid the use of large language models like ChatGPT, even as professors struggle to regulate its use. How can they ensure every student follows the rules? How can they provide a fair learning environment for all? I am currently in the midst of writing my senior thesis, the 50-page capstone of the English major. As I research, outline, and write, I am constantly thinking critically, understanding, and learning, which would all be lost using an LLM. Exposure to artificial intelligence seems to be more and more inevitable, from students in my intro-level classes openly using AI to complete assignments or formulate answers to questions asked by the professor, to a simple Google search now producing an AI overview. In contrast, however, during my research for this program, I was forced to reckon with some of the technology's benefits. For some professionals and experts, AI can drastically increase efficiency, and its personalization has produced positive results in tutoring younger students. So, I can see that despite its environmental, cognitive, and ethical implications, AI deserves a more nuanced evaluation, which I am looking forward to hearing from tonight's panelists. Hannah Beckler is an award-winning investigative reporter for Business Insider. Her recent work focuses on the rise in data center construction and its environmental and economic impact. Her investigation was documented in the series The True Cost of Data Centers, which won the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting. John McCormick is a professor of computer science at Dickinson College and the author of 4 books, including his forthcoming April 2026 release, Thinking AI: How Artificial Intelligence Emulates Human Understanding. Amy McKiernan is an associate professor of philosophy and the director of the Ethics Across Campus and the Curriculum program at Dickinson College. Then-Chi Yu is a professor in energy systems engineering at Cornell University, the chair of the PhD Studies in System Engineering, co-director of the Cornell University AI for Science Institute, co-director of the Cornell Institute for Digital Agriculture, and director of the Cornell AI for Sustainability Initiative. And our moderator tonight, Sara Markowitz, is the assistant director of the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues. She has a master's in global environmental policy from the School of International Service at American University and she previously led the community engagement team of the Carlisle Borough's Climate Action Commission. And now, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We'll start off tonight's panel with a few opening comments from our panelists. To get us started, I'd like to ask Don McCormick to come up to the podium.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Layla, for your land acknowledgement and for the kind introduction. And thank you to the Clarke Forum for the honor and privilege of participating in this panel. I would now like to deliver my own land acknowledgement to the Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei people, the indigenous people of the land where I was raised in Auckland, New Zealand. Ki te tangata whenua, ko Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Now let's turn our attention to this photograph, which was taken somewhere in China around 2018 when the bike share industry was really taking off. And the various companies involved in that industry realized that it was essential for them to dominate market share. And the only way they could do that was to flood the market with bikes, to have bikes all over the city. The result was an insane level of overcapacity and ultimately these immense junk piles of unwanted bikes. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. What happens when a number of companies and their overexuberant investors rush to dominate a new market? Significant overcapacity is one of the possible results. Another example. This slide is a visual metaphor for the notion of dark fiber, which emerged about 25 years ago. So for those of you who are old enough, back in the 1990s, you might recall that the next big thing was perceived to be the internet. And lots of telecom companies were rushing to lay down extra fiber optic cable capacity. Well, what happened after the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s? Dozens of those telecom companies went broke, they were bankrupt, and it seems a lot of the fiber capacity that they built remained unused or dark for some years. So again, what we see is overcapacity of physical infrastructure when companies and investors are rushing to dominate a new market. So I think I can get Feng Chi just slightly out of the way of my slide here. Sorry, Feng Chi. Okay, so you can see my concern here. Are we going to be headed for dark data centers in 2030? Is that what we are going to have in our country? I don't know, but that's the possibility I wanted to introduce into this panel session tonight, the possibility that the frenzied construction of data centers for AI could lead to an irrational level of overcapacity. However, enough doom and gloom. Believe it or not, I am primarily an AI optimist. I suspect that the organizers of tonight's panel, including Sarah, actually brought me on to be the cheerleader as an antidote to the doom and gloom of the other panelists. So don't worry, I will be providing some of that antidote because I am incredibly excited about the possibilities for AI to improve our lives, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion tonight. So thanks again for the opportunity to participate.
All right, and Feng Chi, we'll get you set up here to go next, if that's okay.
Sounds great. Let me try to share my slides, if that's okay. Let me see. What's the best way? Right. Is the slides coming up?
Yes. Yes, we can see
Right,
them.
great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here tonight, virtually or remotely. I work at the intersection of AI, energy systems, and sustainability. So for this particular very interesting panel discussion, I would like to focus on one particular aspect that has been increasingly important. The modern AI scale depends on the computing infrastructure, as John briefly mentioned just now. And in particular, we heard about many times people discussing about data centers. And that infrastructure really drops electricity, needs cooling, and interacts with the local grids and water systems. So those physical connections shape the emissions, resource use, and cost. So the first thing first is that AI energy use is not a fixed number. So I have a figure here taken from a recent paper in Nature. It shows that this energy use of AI tasks really vary widely by the specific type of models and specific type of tasks we are using. And the key takeaway is that there's a wide distribution or a spread. And the tasks are much more intensive, energy intensive than others, even for some numbers of the runs. So when people debate what AI energy use is, we should be very careful about these oversimplified claims. The next one. Oops. It's coming up. Oh, yeah, it's coming up. Sorry. So the second issue is the global electricity demand is growing for many reasons. People tend to be a bit scared about AI. It's going to eating all this energy and so on. But just looking at this particular figure here, other sectors such as industrial electrification, buildings, even electric vehicles are also driving the growing demand of electricity. So data centers are not the only drivers globally. But in some regions, the AI data centers are among the fastest growing electricity users. And that effect is showing up locally. For example, we may have heard about in Virginia, data centers already account for more than 1/4 of electricity use as of 2023, just 3 years ago or 2 years ago. And that share is growing. So in places like that, this is not abstract. It's a real planning and sustainability issues. And finally, the carbon comparison or carbon emissions in this particular bottom right figure, which is a bit dated, is about 6-7 years ago, and focus only on training of the model, like people talk about nowadays, transformer. I mainly use it for the historical context, and it shows that the carbon becomes part of the AI conversation. But today, this bigger question is what happens at the system scale as the data center grow rapidly, and when we account not only for carbon, but also for water and other natural resources. That leads to some of the studies, in the past few years, and was published last year in particular. In this particular study, we try to quantify and to estimate the energy, water, and climate impacts of the hyperscale AI data centers in the US in particular by 2030, or in the next few years. So before we get into these headline energy, carbon, water numbers, I want to show you that all these figures and images here shows why the impacts vary so much and why we need to be careful when we talk about these numerical values. So in the top left here, if you can see the mouse, we change the AI growth into the projected hardware deployment across scenarios, and that's what drives the scale of infrastructure or computing infrastructure in particular. The point here is that demand is geographically concentrated in certain regions. Like for instance, in Virginia, you can see a huge share or very large share for our country's computing demand. In the top left here, these two donut charts, you can see the footprints comes not only from the servers that are doing computing, but also the infrastructure that support the computing tasks. The point is that there's also issues like power delivery and cooling that we should consider in addition to the computing chips. Similarly, for the water piece here, water is not only those we use on site. A large share of the water footprint actually comes from the indirect water consumption that connect to how the electricity is being generated. So down at the bottom here, we highlight why location matters. These power use effectiveness, water use effectiveness are standard metrics for the water energy efficiency in data centers. And as you can see, they vary across locations. The power grid's carbon factors and water factors vary even more by the states and by locations. That's why location matters, and they could change the outcome very significantly. Now the specific context here are the three right panels are showing these energy consumption, carbon emissions, and water footprints from 2024 to 2030 based on our projections. So these numbers are estimated and they involve a large range. The key issue here, as you can see, is that for electricity use, the values are significant enough that, for instance, by 2030, they could be equivalent to almost the same scale of Germany's energy consumption, or roughly about 10% of the US electricity consumption in general. For the carbon emission case, it's equivalent to about 5 to 10 million cars per year. And for the water footprint case, that's almost the same as 6 to 10 million American households' water consumption per year. So these are all significant values, but also involve a large error bar or large variation. The good news here is that these impacts are not fixed. And I like to say the future is in our hand, because our study to find out that the best practice pathway could reduce the impacts substantially, up to 73% reduction in carbon emissions and up to 86% reduction in water footprints compared to the worst practice pathways. So what are the key strategies or what are key methods? Number one is a smart siting. We choose the locations with lower impacts and better infrastructure readiness. And number two is a grid decarbonization. We try to match the rising electricity demand with cleaner supply and the supported infrastructure that's delivered. And the third issue is the efficiency improvement, improving efficiency in the servers, in the cooling system, and in the facility operations. So the best practice versus worst practice panels on the right-hand side here basically shows the gaps. Different choices could push us toward very different outcomes. And the maps here showing the graphical distribution, geographic distribution, reveals that there are real differences across states in terms of carbon and water factors. And that's why siting and location, along with power procurement strategies, are so important. And to connect back to the broader theme of this particular panel, AI is not only an infrastructure challenge, but it also could be an accelerator for sustainability. We could use AI to optimize energy systems, use AI to improve industrial efficiency, and use AI to support smarter operations across buildings and supply chains. So there are dual objectives. We want to manage AI's growing infrastructure footprints responsibly, and we also want to use AI to speed up the efficiency and support the decarbonization in the rest of the economy. So my key takeaway is that AI's real effects are not predetermined. Future is in our hand. The outcomes depend on the choice about computing infrastructure, where it goes, how it's powered, how it's cooled, and how transparent and accountable deployment it is. With practical steps and clear standards, we could capture AI's benefits while reducing these avoidable impacts. And I look forward to the panel discussion soon. Thank you.
All right, we'll invite Hannah up next. Give me 1 second. I'll get our PowerPoint back up here.
Hi all. I'm Hannah Beckler. I'm an investigative reporter with Business Insider. I spent about almost 18 months investigating what we called the true cost of data centers. We were attempting to quantify the sort of electricity impacts, the environmental impacts, and the economic impacts. So I'm going to very briefly run through sort of the top level findings of our investigation. What I'm not going to do is bore you with the methodology. I did write an entire story that sort of walks you through the methodology, but in brief, what we did is we submitted public records requests for air permits that are issued to regulate backup generators at data centers across the country. So data centers can never be without power, so they are permitted to regulate their pollution loads. So we factored in redundancy for those generators as well as server capacity to basically back our way into an electricity consumption for those facilities. We also used them to identify where the data centers are and who owns them, which was a bit of a game between all the shell companies and LLCs that we had to sort of interconnect to be able to unblind those data centers. So this is the number of data centers by year since the first permit was issued. So we identified 1,240 data centers by the end of 2024. That's 4 times the number that we had in 2010. So it was a massive escalation of these kinds of facilities. Of those, 322 are considered the very largest facilities in our analysis, or hyperscalers. Basically, these are the facilities that are spinning up online right now that are really the substantial footprint of what we think of when we're thinking about AI. So again, our analysis allowed us to sort of be able to plot these data centers across the country. So on the low end, we calculated the electricity as a range. So on the low end, we calculated that data centers, if all of these come online, and that is kind of an ongoing question, could consume about the same amount of power as Ohio did, or on the far end, on Florida, it would be about as much as Florida used. So it's a pretty extreme end that we were looking at, but that's had to kind of, we were factoring in a lot of different model types, a lot of different types of facilities, but it gives you a sense of the scale of this thing. At the midpoint, that's about as much power as Poland used in 2023. Our estimate was conservative, so it was actually a little bit under what the Federal Department of Energy report estimated, but that report showed that it could reach the high end of our estimate as early as this year. We also plotted all of the data centers against data on water scarcity. So to kind of go to that placement argument of where are you putting these hyperscalers. Some of the hyperscalers can use up to 3 to 5 million gallons of fresh drinking water every day. So it's a substantial amount of water. But about 43% of hyperscalers are located in areas of high or extreme high water stress. So water stress is sort of a ratio of how much water is available versus how much is being used. I think the other thing to really hit home here is that hyperscalers, if they're using evaporative cooling system to cool their servers, they're using fresh drinking water. So they are competing directly with residents. If you look back at sort of our map previously, you'll notice that, yes, we have a big sort of collection of data centers in Virginia with a huge amount of power, but there are new frontier areas such as Maricopa County, Arizona, outside of Phoenix. We have places in Nebraska, Ohio, lots of other places. Utah, for example, has some massive data centers coming in. Many of them are proposing to be using up to millions of gallons every day. And the final thing I'm going to talk about impact-wise is a lot of the big tech developers talk about the massive economic impact that they're going to have for communities. What we tracked was 37 states that give sales and use tax exemptions to data centers, which results in hundreds of millions, if not close to $1 billion of forfeited tax at the state level. We also tracked municipalities that give 100% 15-year tax abatements, property tax abatements, to some of the largest multinational companies in the world. There's a lot of jobs that come in the construction of these, so I don't want to minimize that impact, but these jobs are temporary. Many of the records we found tracked that individual jobs only last about 6.5 weeks. In comparison, full-time permanent jobs can be under 50, sometimes as few as 25, which means that over the lifespan of these deals, we tracked some that were amounting to as much as $2 million in abated tax lost for those municipalities per job employed at data centers. So the math doesn't always math. And finally, I just wanted to note that this isn't stopping, this is only escalating. So this kind of tracks these CAPEX investments from 4 of the top big developers. We're seeing just massive money going into development of this infrastructure. It's being compared to sort of the Apollo space program. So it's a huge amount of money. It continues to escalate, but they're building it out on this future predicated on this idea of AI, but the impacts in terms of our economy, our environment, and our communities is happening right now. Thank you.
All right, and we'll invite Amy McKiernan up next.
Good evening. Thank you to the Clarke Forum, my fellow presenters, and our audience participants, and especially Sara. Thank you for bringing us together to talk about the impact of AI on our everyday lives. I'll be your resident humanist, and I'm looking forward to learning as much as I can during this session, as well as contributing what I can as an ethicist. In 1983, French philosopher Michel Foucault said, "My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad. If everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do." So my position leads not to apathy, but to a hyper and pessimistic activism. I think that the ethico-political choice we have to make every day is to determine which is the main danger. I think it's accurate to say that AI is potentially dangerous. This does not mean that it is, or at least is all bad. On January 22nd, 2026, Anthropic released an 84-page document called Claude's Constitution. The Constitution reads, "Anthropic occupies a peculiar position in the AI landscape. We believe that AI might be one of the most world-altering and potentially dangerous technologies in human history. Yet, we are developing this very technology ourselves. We don't think this is a contradiction. Rather, it's a calculated bet on our part. If powerful AI is coming regardless, Anthropic believes it's better to have safety-focused labs at the frontier than to cede that ground to developers less focused on safety." For their part, and of great interest to me as an ethicist, is Anthropic's decision to train Claude using a virtue-centered approach to ethics. I think I'm just moving. Cool, yeah. Okay, yeah, so I checked out Claude's Constitution, and what really struck me was the way in which they're taking a virtue-centered approach. So they've hired philosophers who they have on staff, and they say that there are hard constraints, but overall, that Anthropic is attempting to teach Claude how to be a genuinely good, wise, and virtuous agent, capable of being both helpful and morally suspicious. This is especially important given jailbreaking tactics that aim to work around safety protocols by suggesting role-playing or fictionalized scenarios. So, here are a few of those hard constraints in Claude's Constitution. But of course, the jailbreaking is when you might suggest that for the sake of an argument or a hypothetical or give me a fictionalized scenario. So hopefully we have people continuing to do work, making it so that the hard constraints actually do serve as that. And then this is a note in their constitution about Claude being able to be suspicious of arguments that are being made especially important for actions that would be catastrophic or irreversible, where the stakes are too high to risk being wrong. So I'm curious about a chatbot like Claude being able to be suspicious. I'm curious about feeling-based language that's used in the Constitution. And in doing the research for this presentation, I was so surprised by how good many of these chatbots were at having what felt like a conversation. Okay. So with this context in mind, here are just a few initial worries about AI and how we talk about AI. One, I'm especially concerned with what are called death bots or grief bots that create avatars for those who have died using their text messages, emails, voice notes, and videos. I'm concerned also, and more generally, about companion bots. Two, as we think about people turning to AI for therapeutic and romantic connections, and I'm curious to hear more from the group here tonight, what you think about the ways in which some of this has been framed as a possible way to approach those who are feeling lonely in our communities. Second, I worry about the environmental impact of data centers, which I know other panelists are addressing, but I am committed to thinking about the environmental impacts of tech broadly, including streaming and video conferencing, not only AI. I think this is really important, that we don't just point to AI, and that we also then think about our energy consumption and production more broadly. And more than ever, I think we need to sharpen our critical thinking and evaluative skills as AI-generated voice, video, and images are becoming very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to detect. I also worry about assuming that those who work closely with AI are moral monsters with evil intentions. We miss a lot of important ethical considerations if we assume there must be bad intentions for there to be evidence of moral harm. I worry about catastrophizing in the form of the slippery slope fallacy because I know this can lead to widespread panic and fear-mongering, and I don't want us having our conversations about this driven by fear. It's good to feel the fear if we feel afraid, but then hopefully to be able to have good conversations so that can maintain curiosity and critical thinking. And finally, we are attempting to theorize about and practice ethics in an increasingly complicated, deeply interconnected world. Let's be mindful of us versus them framing and our appeals to moral purity in either direction. If we think we can opt out of tech that has become as pervasive as AI has over the past few years, simply by avoiding chatbots directly, we are missing a lot of the ways that AI has already been integrated into other areas of life. We may or may not be able to know all of the ways that AI is being used by systems in which we are embedded. So I want us to be careful with grandstanding and appeals to moral purity. And I'll stop here and look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your opening comments. Actually, if I may. I'll speak from up here just so I can bring Feng-Chi up when I ask his questions. So I'm going to attempt to limit myself to one question per panelist here. So I might combine a couple questions just to make sure we save plenty of time for the audience Q&A. So we'll start again with John this evening. So John, AI has been compared to the Industrial Revolution and electricity in terms of its potential to change many aspects of human life. In what ways are the transformative potentials and potential dangers of AI either over and or underestimated? And just as a follow-up while you're thinking about that, because that question wasn't long enough, you've mentioned that you consider bias to be one of the major dangers associated with AI. Can you speak briefly to how bias is being addressed by experts in AI, and what are the best practices there?
Sure, Sarah, thanks for the really easy questions.
My pleasure.
Okay, so The first one, in a way, is easy for me to deal with because starting about 2 years ago, I completely gave up on all forms of futurism. I cannot guess what's even going to happen 2 months from now in AI, let alone in 2 years. I can't keep up with all the amazing research papers that are coming out every month. There's some new development that is super cool, but I don't even have time to understand it. And, you know, whether an AI system is going to be able to do this capability or that capability 5 years from now, I have no idea. So, but to try and give you some kind of semblance of a sensible answer on that first question about which aspects of AI have been over and undersold, I think the obvious ones where we're going to see some pretty concrete societal changes and, you know, technology actually being used is in self-driving vehicles, including trucks, not just cars. Those are pretty much working now. If we could get all the humans off the roads, I think the AIs would already do a really good job on the roads because they can communicate with each other and stay out of the way. So, yeah, driving, entertainment, computer games, movies, stuff like that. There's lots of just amazing things that people can already do with AI, and I think that's going to continue. Scientific research, which Feng-Chi touched on a little bit, especially with regard to sustainability, but actually all forms of scientific research are being accelerated, all forms that I've kind of looked into are being accelerated by AI. It's really remarkable, and especially biotech stuff and molecular biology. It's just incredible what's being done now. So, and my personal favorite is personal tutoring. I'm just really blown away by the capability of these systems to teach me about stuff that I want to learn about really fast. I don't have to plow through documentation anymore. I can ask exactly the question that I want and get exactly the answer that I want and follow up with more nuanced questions. And it's just the ideal tool for that. So what's been oversold? I really don't know. I'm on the edge about white-collar jobs. I'm really not sure if accountants are going to be, you know, out of a job anytime soon. And what about lawyers and college professors? Not really sure. It's hard to say. But you know, I'll be pleased in a way to see a system that can put me out of a job, because that would be, you know, a really impressive system, and I'd like to know how it works. That'll be kind of fun. Moving on to your second question, bias. So I don't know how many of my students from my introductory class made it tonight, but I just forced them to read something that I wrote a couple of years ago about something that I did 20-something years ago in the late 1990s. I actually accidentally created a biased algorithm, a racially biased algorithm, because I was studying computer vision systems in graduate school. And I created a system for tracking humans in a video based on skin color. And the skin color model that I used was based on myself. I just got a digital camera, which was a rarity at the time, actually. But we had one in the lab. I took a few snaps of my own skin, and the people sitting around me, you can probably guess what color their skin was. And it wasn't until some time later that I realized what a dangerous system that was had it been released into the wild, because it would have been extremely offensive in the way that it would work for some people and not for others. So, you know, this is the classic problem of biased training data, which is well known now, but by no means unsolved. One of the problems being that large language models train themselves on whatever data they can get, all of Wikipedia, all of the books that have ever been written, all of Reddit, anything else they can get, and guess what? There's bias in that data. So, you know, they need to address it. It's a whole industry in itself now. There are academic conferences on bias in AI, and there are lots of very fancy things being done, but it's by no means a solved problem. And in the interest of time, I will stop there, even though there's so many other interesting things to say about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. My next question will be for Feng-Chi.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just getting you full screen over here. So, Feng-Chi, a recent UN report declared that we are entering a period of global water bankruptcy. Your research teams study environmental impact and net zero pathways for sustainable artificial intelligence servers in the USA, which you cited earlier, found that best practices cut emissions and water footprints by 73% and 86% respectively, indicating a feasible pathway to net zero. Can you discuss the advanced technologies that AI companies can adopt to put data center development on that pathway in more detail? And then also, again, another long follow-up. How do the best case scenario and worst case scenarios for water usage efficiencies compare to current water-intensive industries and activities? For example, online, I've seen comparisons of AI data center water use compared to agriculture and golf courses to show that the latter use much more water per year. In what ways are these comparisons helpful? And what do they tell us about the broader picture of our current global water consumption?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I mean, energy, water emissions, these are real challenges, as we all know, right? And we are already aware of these growing greenhouse gas emissions and their impacts. The water stress is also becoming more common, and the risks are very region-specific or area-specific. In our study, we defined the best practice to reduce quite a bit of emissions and quite a bit of water footprints. The technology and strategy behind these pathways will involve a few kind of brackets or a few directions. The first one is electric power, because that's the energy source for these AI data centers. We do need to carefully choose the locations of the facilities and to pair the growth of data centers' electricity demand with the additional renewable generations and also the supporting infrastructure, like the delivery systems. The second one is the cooling on water. We could try to adopt more water-efficient cooling design, try to reduce the evaporative loss, and try to use non-potable or reclaimed waters when feasible. And also we could choose the designs that could reduce the dependency on fresh water in those water-stressed areas and regions. And the third point is the efficiency, as we have talked about, right? Improving efficiency of computing chips, efficiency of servers, power delivery, and even the facility operations. So they could reduce the energy per unit of computing and also reduce the water consumption or water footprint of these tasks. And the next one is the operating flexibility. This is usually overlooked, but think about it. If we could shift those non-urgent computing tasks away from the peak hours or to locations that have more renewable power or less water stress, then they could really help with addressing some of these challenges. So all these things are combined together, right? These are all practical engineering operational choices that we could make and we could implement to move the sector towards a more sustainable future. So to the second question about the best and worst scenarios, people like to make comparisons, and in particular, of course, comparisons are always helpful to give us intuition about the scale. But these comparisons could also sometimes be misleading if they are not made in an apples to apples way. So the biggest issue here is the water impact is local. Think about it. A gallon of water we use in a water-stressed region during a dry season is no way to compare with a gallon of water we use in a water-rich area. Timing and location really matters as much as the total, demand or total numbers we are usually talking about. And the other issue is definitions. That goes back to the, another panelist's comment earlier. Some comparison really mix this concept of withdrawal amount versus the consumption amount. Water consumption is different from water withdrawal. And if you mix all this direct water, on-site water versus the indirect water consumption or indirect water usage in the power generation sector, they could also lead to some misleading conclusions. So in systems analysis, we talk about systems boundary. Systems boundary is very, very important, and we want to make it consistent for all these comparisons and to avoid these unintended consequences. So what these comparisons do usefully highlight some of the interesting issues is that many sectors already use a large amount of water globally. But these new computing demands or new resource demands are concentrated in certain regions, especially in areas with existing water stress. And that could be a locally significant issues. And the same logic applies to the carbon emissions. What matters is not only about how much electricity we use, but more about what we call marginal grid mix and the timing of when this electricity is being consumed, as well as where this electricity comes from. Are they coming from solar or wind? Are they coming from nuclear, hydro, or from some fossil energy sources? They all differ. So there are little bolts and nuts there, and as an engineer, as a scientist, I want to get into these details. But overall, yes, I mean, there are ways we can make a lot of comparisons. But we do need to be careful about all these numbers we are talking about and all the comparisons we are making. It's not a simple, one value to another. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Hannah, my next question is for you. Why are AI companies building data centers in residential areas like in Loudoun and Prince William counties in Virginia and in water-scarce areas like Maricopa County, Arizona in the first place? And as a follow-up, from your reporting, what regulations at the federal, state, and local levels would best protect communities from potential harms? And lastly, I had to ask this one. If you had a magic wand and could enforce one of those regulations immediately, just Hannah Beckler's executive order, what would it be?
Gosh, okay. So, yeah, great questions. Real speculative fiction vibes here. So the answer to the first question is complicated. And it really depends on the company and kind of the developer and what they're looking for. But I can kind of very broadly say there are 4 pieces that developers are looking for when they're thinking about siting. And I'm going to talk about hyperscalers with this particular one, because some of our co-locators are smaller ones that has to do a little bit more with latency and how close you are to large urban areas. But for hyperscalers, you're looking for cheap power, available land, water if you're using evaporative cooling, and then the last thing is your economic development agreements. So you're all kind of using those 4 pieces. So if an area such as, or I guess the 5th maybe is the existence of infrastructure like fiber optic or something like that, right? So in Virginia, for example, birthplace of the internet, you have a lot of existing infrastructure, you have a lot of fiber optic, you have a lot of available power, you have cheap power, so it's very attractive for these big developers to come in. You also have a very lucrative 100%, I think, sales and use tax at the state level. So you're getting a huge amount of money from not having to pay all those taxes. Other communities, you're seeing different deals go down, right? So you're seeing big tech come in and say, well, okay, you don't have the existing infrastructure, but we want to build here. What will you give us? So that's when you see sort of large multinational company, very powerful lawyers, very sophisticated legal arms coming up against your local elected officials, your public, servants, and they're, making these arguments, and that's when NDAs are coming involved in all this stuff, right? So they're able to extract a lot more from those communities sometimes, where they say, well, we're going to be able to give you a lot of jobs, that sort of thing, but as we'd addressed, that's not always the case. But in exchange, you have to give us easy permitting, and you have to fast track our water, and actually this municipality actually has to pay for additional pipes being laid, that sort of thing. So it can be a lot of different things, and they're all kind of negotiating those. If that answers your question about why they're in Loudoun, it's cheap power and sales and use tax. Your next question is, how can policy sort of protect these? I'm going to sound like such a journalist, but transparency. I think you need to have more public officials that are not subject to NDAs, so that communities have a sense of what is coming into their community and how it's going to directly impact them. Increasingly, we're seeing hyperscalers attempt to make sure that the cost of their electricity use is not socialized. And what I mean by that is it's not going to ratepayers, because ratepayers are paying for additional transmission lines or other infrastructure. So they're saying, well, we'll bring our own power. That brings its own issues. So if you look at Musk's data centers in Memphis, for example, wherein they have large natural gas turbines that are running pretty much unpermitted in overburdened communities that are already overburdened by air pollution. These are highly polluting power generation. So, if a community isn't able to really respond to that and understand what's going in, I think that's really problematic. That leads to what I would do with a magic wand. With a magic wand, I would just say that these NDAs on public officials are unenforceable. I think communities have the right to be able to better understand what's happening in their communities, the zoning, how their electricity are being apportioned. This goes both at the municipal level and also at the state regulatory level. So, and I'm looking at many filings at the Public Utility Commission, which regulates monopoly utilities. Many times they are able to submit basically secret filings because they are subject to trade secret exemptions or NDAs. And that really hampers our democratic ability to better understand what's happening with these industries, regulate them appropriately, and make sure that, we understand the burden they're going to be placing on us.
Thank you. Amy, my last question is for you, and again, I'm going to try to combine two questions. You are currently leading the Core Values Project team, which identified 5 values for the college: compassion, curiosity, equity, integrity, and tenacity. Could you briefly speak to how AI use connects to each of these 5 core values? How can students, faculty, and staff use AI in ways that support these values? And/or how might AI use also challenge these values as well? And as a very brief follow-up, Dickinson College does not quite have a policy on AI, or rather maybe it's a non-policy, so to speak. Can you discuss how the principle of ethical reasoning is a piece of this? I want to say non-policy because Dickinson has kind of I don't want to say left it open, but actually I'll let you speak to that. So if you could talk to a little bit about how Dickinson is handling AI use on campus as well.
For sure. Thank you. And I think it will make a good transition, too, for others who are here, who are also teaching and learning at Dickinson, to be able to chime in so that I'm not attempting to speak for everyone here. So I'll take the second question first, which is we've been encouraged as professors to let our students know and be clear with our students about how they may or may not use large language models on assignments and then in the class more broadly. And so the way that I've done that is to have a community agreement in my class, practices we encourage and avoid, and I've asked students how they would want to use AI, because I think that I'm curious to continue to learn, and this process has been one where I have been learning a lot from colleagues about uses of AI that I was not as familiar with, and so I think keeping an open mind in that area is really important to me, and continuing to ask students and to learn from and with students is something that I'm committed to. I think as a college, we probably should have more conversations like this with our full faculty, with our students across the curriculum. And I think it would be good, it's one thing to say, yes, let educators and students in their classrooms make decisions, but then I will look forward to more conversations like this and really appreciate this as hopefully the beginning of some more conversations at the college about ethical use of AI. Because, again, I don't think that closing my eyes is the best way to approach this. I don't think, even if that's tempting, that's where I think I would say integrity is one of the core values, is an important one for us to think about looking at what's actually happening in the world now. And in conversations where justification for the use of AI or the prohibition against AI seems too vague, ask the follow-up questions. This is what I've been doing, asking more questions than I have answers. And I hope that ends up being the approach that we take. I also just see how quickly things are changing. So like I made those slides and then Anthropic already is walking back some of their safety commitments. And like I think just in something called a race, right? If right now what we have is an AI race, then there are going to be competing interests. And when we have competing interests, it's one thing to say, here are our values. And then it's another thing to say, here's our commitment to our values, and there won't be overriding commitments to economic gain or to other interests. So with any kind of set of values, you want to know what's going to happen when those values are in conflict with each other. And I see that at the college, and then I also in like communities would encourage people to be asking those questions of their elected officials, like in what way does an NDA end up conflicting with your commitment that you have to be able to represent me and let me know as a citizen what's going on. And I think that that's a really good example. I want to learn more about the NDAs because that worries me a lot. Yeah, so our core values, compassion, curiosity, equity, integrity, and equity, integrity, and tenacity. Those came out of a grassroots effort to talk with people about Dickinson's values. And I think that what I learned, I want to make a process comment. Those kinds of conversations, those are the kinds I want to have about AI. So when we sat together and we wondered what guides us here as a college in terms of our values, that's what I want us to do with regards to AI. And I want us to be able to do that without quickly either shaming or mishearing or hearing what we want to hear. But I think that that's where some of the commitment to curiosity will be super important, and to compassion. That if you've explained something to someone, once before and they didn't quite get it that time, well, maybe try to explain it again and have some patience and compassion there, as this can feel like a big change. And when there is a lot of fear surrounding things, I think it can get in the way of us being able to talk directly and openly about the ethics of a practice. So, yeah, I think equity and tenacity, yeah, that's your critical thinking. I need us to be vigilant. Like, I need us to keep pushing and asking questions. And I know how that sounds. I think that this process has been a really good one for me, the core values process, because it has been more listening than speaking. And I have learned to go to areas of campus where we have not maybe had as many conversations across the campus as we could be having. And I hope that some of the relationships that we established with the core values process can now also be used to have conversations about use of AI and what that's going to look like. But yeah, I already feel grateful for the patience that my colleagues and students have had with me, as I have gone from everything from like an existential crisis to oh God, the thing that I love the most, what I do in the classroom might be changing radically. And so I want us to be adaptable, but also compassionate as we're trying to make sense of something moving so quickly. And I want to model those values because I'm not so sure that some of the people in positions of power are modeling those values. And at least we can try to do that here.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and open it up for audience questions. Ella, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, now it's time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please wait until a mic reaches you to raise your hand. We reserve the first questions for students, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience.
Hi, my name is Tayaba. I'm a senior here. I'm a computer science major, and my question is for Professor McKiernan regarding the morality, or rather I'd say the liability part of AI. So for our senior seminar, almost every day, if not every class, we're given a set of readings which are about the implications and ethics of AI and how we should be more responsible in development and what it means for us. And one of the most famous examples we're always given is the self-driving car. And so there's kind of like different parties that we can hold liable in the situation. For like the user, they could be careless with how they're driving. The manufacturer could come up with a defective car. Developers could be overlooking the algorithm that develops the car, and then the government or law enforcement, maybe the road design wasn't good enough to release it there in the first place, or the regulations were negligent. So I think like my question from you is, in this situation where liability can be split into different parties, would the best approach be to have more of like a communal, collective responsibility with the safe adoption and use of AI from the user side and also the developer side, instead of just holding one party responsible for its development and kind of like release into society or community?
First, I want your reading list. Yeah, I think so. I don't think that the only blameworthy party is likely going to be the developer there. And I think that the ways in which we would learn how to make something better will also be in and through paying close attention to and listening to users who are involved. But if users don't feel like they could possibly be blamed for the use of that AI, then I just don't see the ways in which they might also be thinking as carefully about their continued use of any of the technology, whether it's self-driving car or something else. So no, I think absolutely it's not only on developers, and it also should be on users. And what we would do is just come up with a set of questions, probably like a solid Venn diagram. What are the shared questions, and what are the questions that we would really want to ask about blameworthiness of users, blameworthiness of developers, and go from there. But that's a great question. No, I don't think users are exempt from blame.
Kobe McClellan, current sophomore, data analytics and computer science double major. My question is for Professor McCormick. You talked about earlier how you made a biased algorithm and you didn't realize it in real time, and it took years later for you to realize it, and how part of it was due to technology you had available to you in the lab that wasn't necessarily available to everybody else. So with how technology is evolving and everybody's kind of racing to get this new tech that the public doesn't really understand or necessarily know about, how do you think situations like yours is going to continue to happen? I know a lot of people look at how AI is being used and they think it's very biased, especially to underprivileged communities. And do you think that part of that is the people who are using it are too focused on just getting to the money, money, development, thinking this is going to be the greatest technology we ever create, that they're not thinking about that, kind of in your circumstance where you was just I just use the people around me. I didn't really think about it. This is something that I had access to that I usually don't. Or do you think that it's actually more sinister behind it?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kobe. It's a tough one. I mean, to be clear, when I made that mistake in, I think it was 1998, I did realize pretty soon afterwards. I actually got a really bad shock because my PhD advisor brought a couple of business executives into the lab to see a demo of the system that I had been playing around with. And it turned out they were from Japan. They were both ethnically Japanese. They did not have the same skin tone as the Europeans that I had trained the system on. So I was immediately freaking out. And for some reason that I'm still not quite sure of, the system actually worked okay on these two individuals. And I was spared a lot of embarrassment, and they were spared a kind of awkward and quite possibly offensive situation. So I realized then what a bad mistake I had made. But then I kind of forgot about it for years, and it wasn't until I was redoing my class a couple of years ago for introductory comp sci, and I decided to include a class about biased training algorithms, which by this time biased training data, which by this time was a very well-known problem. And I sort of had this weird deja vu moment at one point when I was reading about some stuff. And then I remembered, oh, wow, I actually made that mistake myself. It's not necessarily, well, I don't consider myself evil. I mean, maybe I am, but I don't consider myself evil. I don't think I was being deliberately evil when I did that. But I suddenly realized, wow, it's easy to make that mistake. Especially if you just want to get the prototype out, get the next chapter of my PhD thesis written, whatever it might be, or get the new LLM product out before the competitor, which is what it would be today. So yes, there's intense commercial pressures. There are still problems. On the other hand, this is just such a well-known issue now that all the major companies do pay very careful attention to it. They try to get data that isn't biased in the first place. When they can detect bias in the data, they address it in a number of scientifically calculated ways. And you can see, Amy and I were talking yesterday about, for example, GPT-5, the latest thing from OpenAI that makes the ChatGPT. That's their latest big model. They release a thing called a system card for that, which is a document dozens of pages long that analyzes all the possible sources of bias and danger in the model and assesses whether or not it's performing adequately on publicly available benchmarks. So yes, mistakes will continue to be made, I'm sure, especially from smaller companies that are rushing to compete with the big fish. But on the other hand, a huge amount of progress has been made, and I'm optimistic that people will remain vigilant about this, and it's not going to grow as a problem.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Lily. I'm a sophomore here at Dickinson, and I'm also a Carlisle native. And I'm particularly concerned about with the light of the Middlesex Township data center coming so close to campus. I'm concerned about the impact that data centers have on rural and low-income communities. So, Ms. Beckler, you touched on this briefly talking about Memphis, but could you talk more about the impact that data centers have on low-income communities, particularly rural communities?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I think that's kind of an open question right now, and I don't mean to just punt that, but I think there's a lot of questions about how this impacts, again, from a tax base. So I think there's some evidence to believe that when a hyperscale comes in farming land, for example, and you have holdout farmers who don't want to sell, it creates a situation where their property value goes up, and then all of a sudden they can't afford their taxes. It becomes this kind of cascading event, right, where you have then surrounding neighbors who can no longer afford their land. But then, I think it goes beyond just the NIMBYism of it, of that these facilities are difficult to live next to, and it really becomes a concern for community health. So the way our investigation worked is we were looking for those diesel backup generators. I think when people think about these generators, we think of like our kind of mom and pop shop, sort of our own generators. These are, large industrial scale generators that are capable of producing 3,000 kilowatt hours, and so they're just extremely powerful. And then these hyperscalers are installing 600 of them. Now, these generators are not running 24/7, thank goodness. They are highly polluting, but we are seeing a regulatory landscape that is opening up. Increasingly, this idea is that maybe these data centers, they won't be as dependent on the grid, so they'll be able to bring their own power. And it's really difficult right now. There's a big backlog on getting natural gas turbines. It's much cheaper, much faster to get these diesel generators that are intended for emergency use. Those diesel generators are, again, highly polluting. So you have a scenario where you have, all of a sudden a really large sort of point source of air quality emissions that can directly impact public health. So I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to. The other thing is stranded infrastructure so again, these utilities and data centers tend to work in lockstep. If you're building a giant data center in Georgia, for example, I would see a lot of filings, for example, that would say, okay, we're going to build a dedicated $300 million transmission line to serve this one high-load customer. But rather than that high-load customer paying for the entirety of the cost, we're going to socialize that cost. So all the other ratepayers are going to pay for that $300 million transmission line. Now, it's arguable that rural community, they needed the infrastructure. Did they need 1 terawatt hour a year, being able to serve that kind of high load? I think that's arguable that they did not. It's similar with, in Louisiana, there's natural gas turbines coming up to serve a single data center in a very, very rural area. And it's the same kind of thing. If that data center, if we've overbuilt our capacity and we're not going to end up needing that, and then you have a big dark building, those power plants are still going to be there. And who's going to pay for them? Everyone else. So I think there's a lot of concerns like that it sounds speculative right now, but we really need our regulators and our academics, and maybe sometimes our journalists to be paying attention to those kind of questions.
And I can add to that. I read a document that Amy recommended to me by a researcher called Catherine Hayhoe, and she said there was some evidence that low-income communities are suffering a disproportionate proportion of the burden from negative impacts of data center infrastructure.
Hi, my name is Dan. I'm a senior studying math and philosophy. And I guess my question can be addressed to Mrs. Becker as well as Mr. Feng Chi. So my question is, if companies can internalize environmental damage as a cost of doing business, which I think is the case as much as I'm aware of it, like for example, by paying carbon taxes or offsetting emissions, my question is, what prevents unlimited expansion of AI infrastructure as long as it remains profitable? So are there any enforceable ecological ceilings or any economic disincentivize?
I don't know. Hannah, do you want to go ahead first, or do you want me to?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, well, so I think it's a great question, right? The industry was, it's growing. I mean, we did say that it's really booming. And then we'll see a stop, right? So I guess I could try to answer the question maybe in two folds. Number one is, what these sustainability concerns, carbon tax, or even water, penalty, whatever you want to call it, could become a hurdle for the growth of the industry? I don't think so. That's my view, because it's more about putting the responsibility, social responsibility, on the right stakeholders. And of course, who will be the one to paying for these? That's another question, right? Should that be industry only? Should that be something shared by industry and the government, or even some of the general stakeholders, upstream, downstream, or users? That's a different question, right? Because I think that connects to the previous question. Would this data center energy consumption lead to some kind of spike or even a little bit increase of the electricity bill that we are paying every month? Well, we do see it in certain regions, right? And it's all about regulations. It's all about how we plan for the infrastructure. Then the next question, which I would like to bring back a little bit to your question about, about a comment about profitability. I'm not quite sure if all these companies are making profit, or I'm not quite sure if all these data centers are really bringing profits. If you look at what's going on right now, even like companies like OpenAI, I suspect, I'm not sure. I don't have the detailed information. I don't have the detailed financial details, but I'm not quite certain. The profits out there yet. Although of course everyone wants to be competing for this race of computing power, right? Because we know, I think John mentioned that in the growth of AI, essentially we have three key kind of pillars. Number one is data. We get a lot of data now. Number two is algorithm, models, whatsoever, software in general, right? We get better and better tools and models, large language model you're talking about. And number three is the computing power, right? And that's what all these data centers are putting into there. That's what all of these physical issues that you are seeing. And one thing that we have, I would say all the stakeholders, the public, the industry, the government are all aligned is that we means US. We want to be competitive in this space. US has been a leader for AI, and US want to continue to be the leader in AI. It doesn't go without saying. We want to be competitive on that. And to be competitive, we do have to have enough computing power. And to have the computing power, we need to have data centers. And that's driving all these, rush, all these investments and so on, and the future perspective on that. Will this industry slow down at some point? I don't know. we see this dot-com bubble in early 2000. Will there be another AI bubble in the next few years? I don't know, right? But dot-com bubble, as you may recall, largely connected to this internet, etc. But now internet has become a major, part of our daily life. So AI is growing, and it's growing very fast. Personally, I think the industry is going to move on quickly. But whether these data centers you will see 20 or 30 years from now, are they going to be only Earth only? I don't know, right? You heard about a lot of discussions about they want to put a data center in the space, and maybe they will solve some sustainability challenges. You don't want to have emissions in the space, right? They're going to use renewable solar, and there's not that much water consumption or not any water consumption because, the space is a deep, cooling source. It's all about cost. How would you send these data centers there? And then the other thing that I don't think we touched upon much here in this discussion so far is I do want to draw your attention because you guys are the future. Students, you are the future. One thing that we have see is the waste, electronic waste. How often you change your smartphone? Every few years or every year. How often you change your laptop? Every few years. These all involve chips, semiconductors. And these are already big problems, right? I mean, we cannot handle all these things in the US alone. We sometimes have to outsource it to other countries. And now all of a sudden, I think going back to the very interesting example that John mentioned at the beginning of the opening statement, we are going to have a lot of chips here. NVIDIA is making a lot of chips. And all these data centers running with all these computer chips. These computer chips are not going to last forever. There's a short lifetime, in fact, much shorter than a typical car, for instance. A car could last for 10 years, 20 years, and you could have a second-hand car, second-use car. How would you do that for the data centers, all the computing chips? Well, that's becoming a main concern for me. 5 or 10 years from now, we are going to see a lot of electronic waste. How are you going to deal with those? Who will pay for those? What will be the environmental impacts for those? That goes beyond energy, water, and emissions. Electronic waste is much harder to handle. So there are a lot of issues when you get to sustainability. And if a company, in my view, want to be responsible, we talk about ESG, environmental social governance, if you want to be responsible to the society, they should take care of these. That's a simple thing. I clean my driveway, I clean my sidewalk. That's my responsibility for owning my house. And would industry be doing that? Well, we see many examples, positive and negative. And good news is I do see all the big techs, they claim they want to be carbon neutral by this year. They are going to be water positive by this year. Are they going to make it? Let's keep a close eye on this, right? And transparency is important. Auditable, accounting is important. Are they going to do that? Well, let's keep a close eye on those. But I hope I don't use too much time on that.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Edwards. I'm a freshman, and I'm planning to major in biology. So I'm not like a computer science expert by any means, but something that like really struck me is I feel like we are the future as well. And something that I'm worried about right now is being able to be heard and being able to evoke change. It's really hard during this time period. And I was just wondering if you had any advice for that.
If I may chip in, I'm not talking too much. I got a similar question from one of my students. They feel a bit confused and lost. It's not about the job market only. It's about what's going to be the future, right? I mean, nobody could predict what happened 10 years from now. Just like 10 years ago, no one expect language model could become so powerful. And now we are talking about agentic AI and all these tools, new technologies. But that's normal, right? I mean, one example I want to bring up first before I share my comments. So when I was young, there is a job called typewriter. I don't know how many of you use typewriter, right? Basically, decades ago, we need to hire someone to type a document, type a letter. Nowadays, you don't see anybody, or at least I don't see anyone, getting a job just by typing on the keyboards, right? It's really hard to do that. Right? So the role of human, I would say at some point, maybe I will lose job, as John mentioned, and maybe that's not a bad thing, because that means AI is powerful enough to run all the teaching, to run all the research that we are doing nowadays. But then in the meantime, would also create new opportunities. For instance, I'm also teaching quite a bit of AI courses. In the past few years, not long ago, we tend to teach students how to code. Learning coding is something that we keep talking about, right? Learn how to code, learn how to do programming. Now it's a little bit different. I try to teach students not about how to code, but about teaching them how to evaluate or how to judge the code generated by AI. So that's a different role. From doing things to being an evaluator or being a critical thinker. That's a different kind of job, right? Just like, I was joking with my kids at some point. They are very good in criticizing, the lunch is not so tasteful, the dinner is so bad. And at some point, they raise their taste. They improve how to evaluate what's good, pasta and so on. And I'm learning as well, right? And that's somehow we kind of live with AI. So personally, I like to embrace new technologies. That's basically the question. My parents, my mom, for instance, she doesn't know how to drive, and I learned how to drive. But my father, he likes to learn how to drive. He likes driving, and once you embrace new technology, you open up new opportunities. So I think staying open, keep learning, will be a very interesting and potentially robust strategy under this kind of dynamic environment. And again, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen 10 years from now. Just forget about by 2015. Even 10 years from now, it's very hard to predict it. When AlexNet come out in 2010, I think, it's more like AI domain. Deep learning become to be a mainstream of AI research. And then ChatGPT really changed how we think about language model. 10 years ago, or even 6 years ago, when I started to teach the deep learning class, I share a paper with the students, a paper from Google. It's called Attention is All You Need. I think some of you probably know that. There's a foundation of the transformer, and they're asking what transformer is all about. And now it's all GPT whatsoever, right? So again, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but stay open, keep learning. I think the way to learn how to learn is more important than what you learn physically or what you know. And step, abreast with the technologies and so on, I think it's going to be very helpful. Yeah, but it's definitely understandable. It's a confusing time. It's a dynamic environment. But things will get more and more stable, I would hope, as we get used to this pace and speed, But that's my advice in general.
This now concludes our program. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Feng Chi.